Hi everyone, and welcome to the recap of the Arona Open Round number 10, which was also at the same time the last round of the tournament, and I was able to win against Carissa Yip, who is the current women's champion of the United States of America. So obviously very happy to win this final game. It always gives a nice feeling to win the last game of the tournament, even though the tournament didn't go so well for me. It's still nice to at least win the two remaining games of the tournament. So she started the game with e4, I was black, and again we saw the French defense, which came as a small surprise to her because the games before were not on live boards, and therefore she probably didn't see that I played the French defense already twice. I guess she should have subscribed to my channel and watched the recaps here. Then she would have could have prepared against the French. Anyway, she went for the advanced variation. So we already had in one of the games we had knight d2, the Tarrasch variation. In one of the games we had knight c3, the so-called Steinitz variation. And now we got the advanced variation of the French. c5, c3, this is all pretty standard, knight f3, bishop d7. And yeah, we're following pretty mainstream theory here. And here she played this move bishop d3, which is regarded as kind of a tricky sideline, but objectively it's not supposed to be such a huge problem for black. The main line continues bishop e2, and white's idea is, in general, after black goes knight e7, then he wants to go knight a3, because now black won't be able to take on d4 and take on a3, ruining white's pawn structure. But anyway, this is pretty standard theory, and here I think knight g6 or knight f5 is both played with lots of games here. Black has also many different options, like f6 is a very dynamic way to play. Rook c8, simply putting the rook on the possibly open c file. So black in general has many different setups here. But she went bishop d3, and here it's important for black to take and make use that the bishop is on d3 here with queen b6 and immediately attack this pawn on d4. If I would play knight e7 now, here white simply gets a better version. This bishop is perfectly placed on d3. And after knight f5, for example, now white could take right away, which is not possible in the bishop e2 line, which is the main line. So black has to make use of this fact. And after cd4, she played castle. As I said, after cd4, if white recaptures back, then queen b6, and after castle, knight d4 is possible because now the bishop is already on d7, and there is no bishop b5 check, this discovery, which would win the queen if the bishop were still on c8. And this line is also playable for white, but in general, black is fine as long as he knows how to be kind of careful here, not to allow any knight b5 jumps. Playing a6 in time, for example, knight c3, a6 would be quite logical, simply avoiding knight b5 for good. So yeah, this is supposed to be okay for black as well. She castled dc3, knight c3, and now we have some similar position like this. So she gave this pawn, but is arguing that she will have some compensation, which is true, because my pieces are still a bit underdeveloped, and yeah, it's not easy for me to see where my pieces want to go. I mean, I knew the plan with bishop c5 followed by knight e7, but it's not the only one. For example, I checked now what I had in my notes, and I played a6 in the game, but knight e7 was actually my main line. Knight b5 is not a threat yet because I can simply play knight g6, and knight d6 I can take, and this pawn on d6 is very weak and will fall. Bishop g5 is the move for white, and now there's quite a nice trick that h6 loses to knight b5 here, and I cannot move the knight because the queen is hanging on d8, and if I take on b5 then there's mate on d6, so yeah, that's not what black should do, but a6 is the move, simply stopping knight b5, and then some kind of similar position to the game comes. But yeah, this is what I actually wanted to play. But in the game, I didn't really remember. I played a6, which I also remembered is possible. The idea is simply to prepare bishop c5 and always to cut out this knight b5 option, just in general. She played rook e1, still pretty fast, and now I remembered that bishop c5 is the move, but I couldn't recall what black is supposed to play after knight g5. and I didn't want to risk her being in some preparation here. I just checked knight h6 is apparently supposed to be played. Simply the point of knight g5 is queen h5 will come, and pawn on f7 is quite a target. h6 anyway, queen h5 will come and cannot take on g5 because queen h8 wins the exchange in the game. Anyway, knight h6 is possible, and then black has some ideas like queen b6, and black is very much fine here, but I didn't recall and didn't want to risk it. So I played h6, simply cutting out knight g5, and here she played h4, kind of a typical move, but I was anyway not really intending to play g5. I simply wanted to avoid her from playing knight g5, but yeah, anyway, h4 is kind of okay. I more or less thought she would play bishop e3, simply stopping me from playing bishop c5, and later on she could have ideas like knight a4, knight b6, or bishop b6, and white has definitely enough compensation here. But she played h4, bishop c5, and now queen d2, and already I thought this cannot be really that correct. Her plan was to play queen f4 and queen g4, hitting the pawn on g7, but I felt like it should be too slow. I played knight e7. The computer also gave h5 here with a big advantage, but I didn't even think about this move. It's, from a human perspective, it looks quite strange to weaken the square on g5, but he simply argues the knight is coming to g4, hitting the pawn on f2, and it's also very good for black. I played knight e7, and she played bishop b1 here, which again came as a surprise. I mean, her idea was that after castle now she has queen d3 or queen c2 and some mating threats here on h7, but obviously I'm not castling. Here I spent way too much time, and in the end I simply played rook c8. What I thought about first was d4, which is very concrete, and after knight e4, bishop b4. And at first I thought I might win the exchange here, but after knight d6 check, I kind of have to take, because king f8, queen f4 would be quite unpleasant here on f7. And after takes, white's bishops are opening up, and white is definitely not worse here. That's what I realized after some time. So that's when I stopped to consider d4, and then I thought that knight g6 is maybe possible. I was not afraid of her to take, because then I could simply castle, and often rook takes f3 is in the air, and black has a much better position. h5 I was also not that afraid, because knight h4 comes, and if I exchange this knight, then the pawn on e5 will also be quite weak. I was only not so sure after g3 what will happen, because if white gets another move, then h5 happens, and then I have to retreat with the knight. But it turns out that d4 here is quite strong, and now with the knight being on g6 already, I often have ideas to take on e5, and objectively this is much better for black. So knight g6 would have been maybe better than my move, but the best move for black, which I didn't consider at all, is g5 here. And I'm simply opening up the king side, and I'm planning to castle queenside here. After knight g5, queen c7, castling queenside, and then simply everything comes rook g8, or doubling on the h file, and it's already winning for black. So I did not consider that at all during the game. For example, queen f4, long castle, knight f7 doesn't work because of rook f8, and white will lose material because of this pin here. Queen g5 basically the same. Queen b6 now is possible, hitting the pawn on f2, and after rook e2, long castle. And again, black is already winning here. So g5 is something I completely missed. I went rook c8. She played a3, knight a5. I thought it was quite logical, potentially threatening knight b3 or knight c4. And after b4, I quickly played knight c4, and I should have gone knight b3 here, which is actually very logical. But after queen b2, I did not see this move bishop d4 here. I only saw that knight a1 doesn't work, because after bc5, the knight on a1 is trapped, and white has two pieces for the rook, which is pretty good for white. But bishop d4 is simply very strong. She has to take, knight takes back, and now I'm just a clean pawn up, and white has this trick with knight d5, but here knight f3 check is very strong, forcing white to ruin her pawn structure here with gf3, and now both moves are good. ed5 is apparently better according to the computer, so that the bishop can come into the game, but knight d5 is also very comfortable for black. I played knight c4, which was also not a bad move itself, but now it became pretty complicated. Queen f4, bishop a7, knight g3, and here I played g6, which I was not so happy about, but it's probably the best way to defend against this. Rook g8 I could also defend like this, but then bishop h7 is there, and the rook has to go, pawn on g7 is hanging, and yeah, this is a disaster for black. King f8 is the other pretty serious move, but I wanted to be able to go with the king to the queen side as well, as we will see later in the game. Because the king on the king side is in general not so safe. I played g6, knight e2, and here I played knight c6. And important fact here, I'm simply preparing queen e7, and bishop takes g6 doesn't work because I have rook g8. Important not to take here, because then my king would really be in trouble. But I have rook g8, and white has nothing, is simply losing the piece. After takes queen f4, simply king e8, and after queen h6, queen e7. King is totally safe, and yeah, white is piece down, and the king on g1 is pretty weak as well. She played rook a2, queen e7, bishop f4, and here I played king d8, which was very interesting for sure. Probably not the best way. My idea was simply to put the king here on the queen side, where I hoped that it will be safer than on e8. The computer also says this move queen f8 here, which I didn't really see. The point is that black now wants to play knight e7 and then knight f5. Without this, for example, here after knight f5 takes, queen g7 would win. But with the queen being on f8, the g7 square is protected. And yeah, for example, bishop d3, knight e7 argues that black is again better here. But queen f8 is a pretty strange move, I have to admit. So is king d8, but at least I have a very straightforward plan. If you played knight h2, king c7, knight h2 hinting at knight g4, but knight g4 doesn't work because now I'm really playing g5, and after takes, for example, bishop c1, I go rook h4, followed by rook h8, and mate on h1 is basically inevitable. She played knight c3, I simply went king b8, and now she went b5. I also thought about knight d4 here, which might have been smarter, because in the game she got some counterplay with b5, and knight d4 probably just cuts this option out. Important detail here is that knight d5 just doesn't work. e6 is a discovered check, but after king a8, white cannot take back the piece because the rook on e1 is simply hanging. So this was the game, takes, and now it got kind of out of control. I played bishop c5, bishop d3, and now knight d4 was already maybe not the best. Again, the computer always says g5. I even saw this here in the game, but in this variation after rook g8, bishop e7, basically forced, rook g3. Now white cannot recapture on g3 because of this pin here, but what I missed is that after bishop c5, the bishop on d3 is hanging. So I calculated until here, but I just didn't see that the bishop is hanging, and here black is just much better. I went knight d4 instead, knight d6, and here I went in the completely wrong direction with knight takes d6. I should simply play rook c7. It's not so simple, but I simply cannot allow white to have this very strong pawn on d6. And after rook c7, I'm still much better. He cannot take on c4 because then knight f5 is coming, pawn on h4 will fall, or some g5 comes, and black's attack is much faster than white's. But I took, and here I went queen f8, which again wasn't an accuracy, but we were both already pretty low on time. Queen d8 would be better for some reason, so that g5 can be supported in a better way, but yeah, it was pretty hard to see on the board. She played rook b1, which was very good. King a8, rook b2, simply doubling the rooks and hitting b7. I played bishop c6, and here she could have gotten basically a decisive advantage with d7. I cannot take back this pawn because rook b7 and my king is in quite some trouble here. And after rook d8, knight f3 is, I think, the only winning move, which is not so easy to see. And after takes, rook d7, simply bishop b5. And even though black is up 2 pawns, the king on a8 is too weak, and white is winning here. So I was lucky here. She played rook c1, which simply allowed me to go back to a7, and now again, it followed by another mistake, bishop d2. Bishop e3 would be better for some reason, but here I believe black is already pretty okay again. She went bishop d2, and I think she missed this knight f5, which I played. f6 is also pretty good, by the way, simply preparing e5 and then picking up the pawn on d6. But knight f5 was more forcing her to take, otherwise I simply grabbed the pawn on d6. She took, and the gf5, and the rest of the game was pretty clean. Here I'm again winning, because the g file is opened. After d4, this bishop becomes a monster, and the pawn on d6 will fall. But there was still some accuracy needed. Bishop f4. I played f6. I could have also gone rook g8 first, and then queen g7, and after g3, f6. Kind of similar to the game. But after f6, queen b3, now I just had to be careful, because, for example, e5 would be losing because of rook takes e6. And white is eliminating the defender of the pawn on b7, and now white would be winning. So that's why I played rook h7, because now after rook c6 I can simply take back, and the pawn on b7 is protected. So nice geometry here with rook h7, even though the rook is on the other side of the board, still protecting b7. I guess the same would also be possible with moves like queen f7 or queen g7. But I like rook h7. She played queen d3. Idea now that after e5 she has queen f5, and the pawn and the rook on this h7 is hanging. That's why I played rook d7 first, knight f1, d4. Again, my idea at first was to play e5, and after queen f5 I just realized that ef4 doesn't work, because now rook takes c6, and it's not so clear anymore. Take on d7 and anything could happen. But queen d6 would lead to something very similar to the game. Black is also winning here. I played d4 first, bishop g3, prophylactic against e5, and now e5 anyway, queen f5, queen d6, knight d2, and here there were many wins. I could already start pushing this pawn, and at some point simply queen d5 will come, which is pretty killing. These two bishops are very strong now. I played rook c7 first, rook e1, now d3, king h2, rook d8, kind of unnecessary. I could have gone to g8 right away, but I wanted to prepare for some knight e4, possibly, that then the rook could support the d-pawn. Now f3, and now I played rook g7, knight c4, queen d4, and rook g7 is, here I thought it's already over, because rook g8 is coming, and she cannot defend this bishop, and if the bishop retreats, then the pawn on g2 is always falling. Knight c4, queen d4, rook b4, and I simply ignore this discovery here, rook g8 simply. She played knight e5, knight b6 would be similar. I can simply give the queen here, and the bishop is gone, and so is white's king. She tried it with knight takes e5, but I simply recaptured. Computer says also queen d5 is winning. Also quite logical, pinning this and simply taking on g3 in the next move. Took on e5, rook takes d4, and now I took ed, but bishop d4 is also winning. White is up a queen for rook and bishop, but yeah, black's pieces are just placed perfectly. Bishop has to move, and rook g2 is winning. I played it with ed4, and after bishop e5, now rook g2, and king h3, rook f2, and here she resigned, because rook takes f3 is coming, and there's not much she can do. She could have also tried king h1, but here I have d2, and after rook d1, at least what is winning is rook g1, I guess. Although this is not so clear, because after takes, she doesn't have to take, but she could go king h2, and now there's mate threatening here. So yeah, but I guess there has to be, I mean, a few wins, basically anything. Just looks totally winning. So yeah, this game was also very, very bumpy, but got the win in the end somehow. I mean, in the opening, it was, I should go for this g5, but I simply totally missed it. Let's go back to this moment. Here, bishop e1, g5 is so strong, but I totally underestimated that my attack on the king side will be so strong. Simply queen c7, long castle. I think quite an instructive moment. And later on, I'm quite happy with this king run. It's quite a creative plan with king d8. But later on, it kind of went into the wrong direction. I should have gone for some g5 at some point, but in the end I was lucky anyway, and I'm happy to get the win. So yeah, thank you for watching. This was the recap series from the Arona Open. It's Open is now finished, and anyway, let me know in the comments which sort of content you would like to see when I'm back home. I'm planning to continue making videos. I really enjoy it, and yeah, so Thank you for watching and see you at the next time. Bye-bye.